All right, let's talk about our hip dominant pattern. And what I mean by hip dominant is your hip is going through the biggest change in angle. So that's going to be things like your deadlift, your hip thrust, those kind of things. So we're going to talk about vertically oriented hip drive or hip hinging patterns. So a couple of things here. Stance, we go hip width and then about half of the width of your foot wider than that. That's going to be pretty good. Feet, ideally, we'd like to have them square. We can have a little bit of an outward toe turn if we need to. So from here, the big key is we're hinging through the hips and we're maintaining a nice neutral position through the lumbopelvic area. So let's say I'm doing something like an RDL. I'm going to get my stance and then make sure that my movement is driving my hips back and then driving my hips forward. So the rule is if your hips are not in motion, you should not be in motion. When you're talking about a traditional full range of motion deadlift, we're going all the way down to the floor. We're going to have some more knee bend. Those mechanics get a little bit more detailed. I prefer to keep a little bit of a buffer in there and go through this hang position to create a little bit more in the way of safety. We can load a little heavier and stay out of some of that danger area. Now, one of the common errors people make, instead of going with a hip hinge, they go with a pelvic tilt. So they kind of do that belly button forward, dump the bucket, overarch the back, and then they try to go into their hinge. So a nice drill you can work on is one hand on your belly button, the other hand at your low back, and then simply go through a series of hip hinges. And you don't want to have your belly button getting stretched out, and at the same time, you don't want to have your back getting rounded. So if you start to feel any change, whether the belly button pressure or low back, you know you're going through some manipulation or tilting of the pelvis instead of simply hinging through the hip joint. Here and back up. Now, as far as knee flex, we want to keep about a 15 to 20 degree bend in your knees as you go down. So we're not trying to lock them out and go. That's going to put a lot of tension in the hamstring. We're going to have a lot more hamstring activity coming up. So hamstrings are supposed to participate in this, but we need your glutes to be the primary driver. Forward view, a couple of things you can do to make this more effective. So before you begin your hip hinge, you're going to try to separate whatever you're standing on with your feet. So it's isometric, you're not going anywhere, but as soon as I push out, I'm going to feel his glutes turn on automatically. Once I have that outward pressure, now I'm actually going to try to unscrew. Again, feet aren't going to change position, but I'm going to engage that isometrically. So I'm pushing out, I'm unscrewing, and then I'm going to go through my hip hinge and then come back up. Hip hinge and back up. Outward pressure, unscrew, hip hinge, come back up, squeeze your glutes at the top, hip hinge, come back up, make sure you squeeze your glutes at the top. Now, another way you can make this a little more effective is from that bottom position, engage your pelvic floor as you're coming up. So I'm pressing out, I'm unscrewing, I've got a good hip hinge, nice neutral lumbopelvic posture, and I'm going to engage the pelvic floor. It's like you're stopping the flow of urine, and then come up and squeeze my glutes as tightly as I can, and then go back down. So all these rules are going to apply if you are standing and going through a hip hinge, a single leg hip hinge. Basically any variation of that, we're still going to have the same basic biomechanics. So very quick review, a little wider than hip width stance. You're going to spread the floor and unscrew, maintain a nice neutral position at the lumbopelvic area, and then drive the hips back, maintaining a 15 to 20 degree bend in your knees, drive the hips forward and squeeze. If your hips aren't going backwards, you should not be in motion. So be very mindful of your exercises. Don't simply grab something and start going through the movement. We need to make sure we're encouraging proper patterns and we're getting the most out of the exercise that we can. Most importantly, we want to make sure we're not getting into any positions where we could get some kind of an injury.